Barbara Lewis had 11 days left before First Prairie Bank took the only home she had ever known, along with the $340,000 in debt she never asked to owe. But 3 miles away, tucked inside a cedar chest her husband left behind, something was about to change. Everything the bank thought it knew about that land. The coffee maker in Barbara's kitchen still gurgled at 5:12 every morning, the exact minute it had gurgled for 31 years, because Donald had set the timer that way, back when they were newlyweds, and never touched it again. Barbara hadn't touched it either. She stood at the window above the sink the way she always had, watching the flat grey light climb over the wheat stubble, and for 1/2 second each morning she forgot he was gone. Then she remembered, and the day started the way every day had started for the last 4 months, quietly and a little too heavy to carry alone. She was 52 years old, and until this past March, she had never once written a check for the farm. Donald had handled the loans, the equipment, the seed orders, the arguments with the co-op. Barbara had handled the books in the sense of keeping them tidy, not in the sense of understanding what they meant. When his heart gave out behind the wheel of the grain truck, it took him fast. The doctor said he likely never felt it. And it left her holding 4 decades of decisions she'd never been part of. Her mother had died young. Her father had drunk himself into an early grave. Donald was supposed to be the one who lasted. He was supposed to be the one who buried her. On the windowsill above the sink sat a squat glass jar, half full of dried seed. Heirloom sorghum Donald had saved every autumn since before they were married. Generation folded into generation. Jar refilled every October like a promise renewed. Barbara didn't know the science of it. She only knew that every year he'd hold a handful up to the light before pouring it back in, like he was checking on old friends. There was a second memory that came with the coffee maker's gurgle, one she hadn't let herself think about in weeks. Donald used to stand behind her at that same window some mornings, coffee in hand, and narrate the fields like a man reading a letter from an old friend. That low patch by the creek always floods first. That strip along the fence never yields quite as well as it should. Someday I'll figure out why. She used to tease him for talking to dirt. Now she would have given almost anything to hear him do it one more time. She rinsed her mug, set it in the rack, and glanced at the calendar taped beside the fridge, where she'd circled a date in red ink 3 weeks ago. 11 days. After that, none of this would be hers to stand in anymore. The letter had come on a Tuesday in June, 4 months to the week after the funeral, and it hadn't wasted time on sympathy. First Prairie Bank regretted to inform Mrs. Barbara Lewis that, following a formal appraisal, the collateral value of the property known as Willow Bend Farm, 640 acres in Ellis County, Kansas, had been assessed at insufficient value to secure the outstanding balance of $340,000. 90 days to cure the default. 90 days that had already burned down to 11. She had read that letter 11 times before she understood what it actually meant. It meant the land Donald's grandfather had broken with a mule team in 1931. The land where their son had learned to walk between rows of milo. The land where Donald himself was buried under the cottonwood at the property line. All of it had been declared on paper essentially worthless. Depleted soil, falling yields. A decade of drought stress and conventional overplanting that had thinned the topsoil until the bank's own appraiser wrote, in a single flat sentence, that the acreage no longer justified its lean position. Barbara set her coffee down harder than she meant to. The mug cracked against the counter, but didn't break. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat stubble the way it always did, indifferent to deadlines. And somewhere past the tree line, a screen door banged that used to be Donald's excuse to go check the weather. She stood there a moment longer than usual, one hand flat on the counter, and told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for 11 days, that she would find a way to keep this. She didn't yet know how true that was about to become. She thought about calling her son that morning, and didn't. Jason lived in Wichita now, 2 hours east, with a job in logistics and a life that had never much involved the farm, even before Donald died. He'd offered, gently, more than once, to help her figure out the numbers, and every time she'd told him she had it handled, mostly because admitting otherwise felt like one more loss, stacked on top of the others. She wasn't ready yet to be the mother who needed rescuing. She wasn't sure she ever would be. Instead, she pulled on her boots, the same pair she'd worn to feed the barn cats every morning since March, and walked the fence line the way she had almost every day since the funeral. Not because there was anything useful in it, but because it was the one habit that still felt like hers. The stubble crackled under her boots. Somewhere behind the barn, a hawk circled low over the creek bottom, patient the way hawks always were, and Barbara found herself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly she was supposed to do with 640 acres of land she had never been taught to run. Grady Simmons had been the loan officer at First Prairie Bank for 19 years, and in all that time he'd learned to deliver bad news the way a man delivers weather, as though he had nothing to do with it. He sat across the desk from Barbara on a Thursday morning, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a manila folder open between them, with the appraisal clipped to the front. "I want to be straight with you, Mrs. Lewis," he said. "The soil tests aren't good. Organic matter's down to under 2% in 3 of your 4 fields. Erosion along the creek line. Frankly, if Donald had come in 2 years ago, we'd have had options. Now we're looking at a property that costs more to farm than it earns." Barbara asked what her options were. Grady slid a second sheet across the desk, a short-term extension, 60 days, at a rate that made her stomach drop when she did the math in her head. "Or," he said, not unkindly, "you sell. There's interest. Corporate operations have been buying up marginal ground all through this county for pennies, folding it into bigger rotations they can absorb the loss on. You'd walk away with something instead of nothing." She didn't answer him that day. She drove home with the extension papers folded on the passenger seat, and she didn't touch them for 3 days. The second obstacle came from inside her own family. Donald's younger brother, Curtis, drove up from Salina on a Sunday with a 6-pack he didn't offer to share, and an opinion he didn't wait to be asked for. He stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets, looking at the barn the way a man looks at something he's already decided to sell. "Barbara, I love you like a sister," he said, "but you're not a farmer. Donald was the farmer. There's no shame in letting it go. Take what the bank offers, take what a buyer offers, and go live somewhere that doesn't need 300 gallons of diesel a week just to survive." She told him she'd think about it, mostly because it was easier than telling him no to his face. But that night, lying in a bed that still smelled faintly like Donald's aftershave on the pillow he never used, she found herself furious in a way grief hadn't let her be yet. Furious at the bank for reducing 40 years to a number, furious at Curtis for saying out loud the thing she was afraid was true. Furious a little at Donald for leaving her a debt he never once mentioned, and a farm he never taught her to run. The third obstacle came from a place Barbara hadn't expected. The co-op, where the Lewis family had bought seed and fertilizer for 3 generations. She'd gone in to ask about extending credit through harvest, the way Donald always had in lean years, and the manager, a man named Dale who'd known her husband since high school, had shaken his head before she'd even finished the sentence. "Barbara, I'd love to help you out, I would. But corporate's tightened up who gets carried on the books this year, and with the bank's paper already flagging the property, I can't put the co-op's neck out for it. I'm sorry. I really am." She'd driven home with an empty truck bed, and a feeling in her chest like a door closing quietly, one room at a time, until there'd be nowhere left to stand. She was still awake at midnight when she remembered the cedar chest. It had sat at the foot of their bed for as long as she could remember, and she had always assumed it held nothing but old quilts and a few photographs from before her time. But something pulled her out of bed that night. Restlessness or grief, or the simple need to touch something that was still his. And she knelt in front of it and opened the lid for the first time in months. Beneath the quilts, wrapped in a flannel shirt she recognized as one he'd stopped wearing years ago, was a leather-bound notebook, its spine cracked soft from handling, its pages swollen slightly with age and damp. She opened it under the lamp and found Donald's handwriting. Small, slanted, familiar in a way that made her chest ache, filling page after page with diagrams she didn't understand. Field maps divided into strips, notes in the margins about legumes and cover crops, about something called soil biology, underlined twice. Dates going back 9 years, a rotation schedule unlike anything they had ever actually planted. At the bottom of one page, in ink darker than the rest, as though he'd pressed the pen harder while writing it, was a single line. "If I ever get the nerve to try this properly, it could change everything about this ground. Someday." Barbara sat on the floor of their bedroom until almost 2 in the morning, turning pages she didn't fully understand, feeling for the first time in 4 months that Donald had left her something besides debt. She didn't know yet what it meant. But what she didn't know was that this notebook, dismissed by no one, hidden by accident rather than intention, was about to become the only thing standing between her and losing everything. She brought the notebook to the kitchen table the next morning and spread it open beside her coffee. And for the first time since the funeral, she felt something other than grief pulling her attention. Something closer to curiosity, sharp and unfamiliar, like a door left open a crack. Most of it made no sense to her on its own. Donald had never gone to agricultural college. Everything in these pages had clearly come from years of reading, from farm journals and extension bulletins, and, judging by one dog-eared brochure tucked between 2 pages, a regenerative agriculture conference he'd apparently attended alone in Manhattan, Kansas, 6 years earlier, and never once mentioned to her. The notebook described a rotation built around cover cropping and diversified planting. Sun hemp and hairy vetch worked into the soil between cash crops, wheat and grain sorghum rotated with legumes instead of planted back-to-back season after season. No-till practices meant to rebuild the organic matter that the bank's appraisal had flagged as critically low. It was patient work. It was work that paid off over years, not months, and it was work Donald had never once tried on their own 640 acres, because every season there had always been a reason not to risk it. A loan payment due, a bad year already behind them, a fear of being the one who gambled the family's ground on an idea from a pamphlet. Barbara drove into Hayes that same afternoon and sat across from a county extension agent named Priya Nasser, sliding the notebook across the desk like she was asking a doctor to read an X-ray. Priya paged through it slowly, and Barbara watched her expression shift from polite interest to something sharper. "This is a legitimate regenerative rotation," Priya said finally. "Whoever wrote this knew what they were reading. It's slower than conventional farming. You won't see full results in one season, maybe not even two. But it rebuilds organic matter. It holds water better in drought years. And long-term yields on land like yours can actually exceed what you're getting now. The issue is startup cost. Cover crop seed isn't cheap, and you'd be taking at least one field, mostly out of cash production, the first year to get the rotation established." Barbara did the math out loud before she could stop herself. She had 11 days to satisfy the bank, and this was a plan that needed at least one full growing season, maybe two, before it proved anything to anyone. Priya must have seen the calculation cross her face, because she added more gently, "There's also a USDA cost-share program for cover cropping. It won't cover everything, but it might buy you enough room to start." "And if it doesn't work?" Barbara asked. It was the question she'd been avoiding since she'd first read the notebook by lamplight, and saying it out loud in a county office made it feel more real than it had at midnight in her bedroom. Priya didn't sugarcoat it. "Then you're out the cost of the seed, and a year you can't get back. I won't pretend there's no risk. But Mrs. Lewis, the soil tests you have now already say you're losing this farm slowly, whether you try this or not. The only question is whether you lose it doing the same thing that's been failing for 10 years, or doing something that at least has a chance." Barbara drove home with the notebook on the passenger seat, where the extension papers had sat 3 weeks earlier, and somewhere on the county road between Hayes and the farm, staring at wheat stubble that stretched flat and pale in every direction. She made the decision without quite deciding to. The way you step off a ledge before you've fully agreed with yourself that you're going to jump. That night, Barbara called Grady Simmons before she lost her nerve, and asked for the 60-day extension after all. Not to sell, she told him, but to try something. He didn't sound optimistic. "Mrs. Lewis, I have to be honest with you. 60 days isn't going to change a soil test." But he approved the extension anyway, mostly, she suspected, because it cost the bank nothing to wait 2 more months for the same outcome he already expected. What Barbara didn't yet understand was that 60 days was never going to be the number that mattered. 2 full harvests were. The second obstacle arrived a week later, in the shape of her own equipment. The Lewis Farms drill, the machine that would plant the cover crop seed into the existing stubble without tearing up the soil structure. Donald's notebook insisted on protecting, was 14 years old and built for conventional planting, not the precise seeding depth the new rotation required. A retrofit or a rental would cost more than Barbara had left after the seed order alone. She sat in the shop with the notebook open on the workbench, running numbers that refused to add up, until Sam Whitfield's truck pulled into the yard unannounced. Sam had farmed the section next to the Lewis place for almost 40 years, had known Donald since they were boys pulling calves together, and had said almost nothing to Barbara since the funeral beyond a nod at the visitation. He climbed out of his truck, looked at the old drill, and said, "Heard you're trying something different." Word traveled fast in a county that size. Barbara braced for the same lecture Curtis had given her. Instead, Sam said he had a no-till drill, sitting mostly idle since his own son had taken over the home operation, and he'd rather see it working than rusting. He wouldn't take rent for it, not that first season. "Donald helped me get my combine out of a ditch in 2009 at 2 a.m, he said, like that settled it, and climbed back into his truck before Barbara could argue. It wasn't charity that moved her, standing in that shop afterward. It was the sense, for the first time in months, that she wasn't doing this entirely alone. The planting itself humbled her more than she expected. She had watched Donald work this land her whole married life, but watching and doing were different animals entirely. The first week on the drill, she misjudged the seeding depth on nearly 11 acres, and had to replant a strip along the north fence line by hand-checking every few yards, kneeling in dirt that still felt unfamiliar under her palms, even after 3 decades of living beside it. Her back ached in ways it never had. Her hands blistered in the exact places Donald's had always been calloused, and some nights she sat at the kitchen table afterward and cried, not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer physical exhaustion of learning at 52, a language her husband had spoken fluently and never taught her. Curtis called twice that month to ask if she'd come to her senses. Barbara let both calls go to voicemail. The first real setback came in early June, when a hard rain hit the county 2 weeks after planting, and washed a shallow gully through 6 acres of the new cover crop along the low ground near the creek, the exact patch Donald used to say flooded first, the one she'd heard him name from the kitchen window her whole married life, and never once thought to ask him more about. She stood at the edge of that gully in the mud, seedlings torn out and scattered, and felt something in her chest go hollow in a way it hadn't since the funeral. It felt, in that moment, like proof that Curtis was right, that some things weren't meant to be learned at 52, that Donald's notebook was a beautiful idea that belonged to a man who'd had 30 years to work up the nerve to try it, not a widow with 11 days turned into 11 months, and no formal training past a high school diploma. She called Priya that evening, ready to be told the plan was already failing. Instead, Priya drove out the next morning, walked the gully with her rubber boots sinking into the wet ground, and pointed out something Barbara hadn't let herself see yet. The fields on either side of the washout, where the vetch and sun hemp had already rooted deeper than a few weeks should have allowed, had barely eroded at all. The gully had cut cleanly through the one strip where planting had been delayed by a drill malfunction, and the roots hadn't yet taken hold. "This isn't the plan failing," Priya told her, crouching to show her the tangle of roots holding soil together, 6 inches down where the ground was undamaged. "This is the plan working everywhere it had a chance to. You just found the one place it hasn't had time yet." Barbara reseeded the damaged acres by hand over the following week, on her knees in the mud some mornings before the sun was fully up, and found in the repetitive, unglamorous labor of it something she hadn't expected, a kind of quiet that grief had never quite given her. There was no room, kneeling in wet dirt, pressing seed into torn ground, to think about anything except the next handful, the next 6 inches, the next small act of stubbornness. Donald, she thought more than once that week, had never once told her he loved this part. Maybe he hadn't known how to say it. Maybe this was what he'd meant instead. All those mornings narrating the fields from behind her at the window. By midsummer, the reseeded ground had caught up with the rest, and the gully itself had begun, slowly, to green over at the edges. It wasn't a triumph. It was closer to a truce, the sense that the land and her stubbornness had reached some kind of working agreement, one that neither of them had fully trusted at the start. By the time the cover crop was in the ground across 200 acres, sun, hemp, and vetch threading green through stubble that had been bare dirt every fall for a decade. Barbara had used almost all of the cost-share funding and a good portion of her own savings. The wheat and sorghum fields she hadn't touched yet sat beside the new ground, like a held breath. And every morning she walked the fence line before sunrise the way Donald used to, checking the soil with her hands instead of her eyes, the way the notebook told her to. She still hadn't told Grady Simmons the full plan. She wasn't sure yet that it would work, and she wasn't ready for him to tell her it wouldn't. Then, on a Wednesday in late September, the second letter came, and it wasn't from the bank at all. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address, forwarded twice, and inside was a single typed page from an agricultural attorney in Topeka named Howard Reese. Barbara read it, standing in the driveway with the mail still in her hand, and had to read it twice before the words settled. Donald had, 4 years earlier, enrolled a portion of the Lewis land, the same 200 acres she'd just planted to cover crop, in a regional soil conservation easement program, a legal designation that offered tax incentives for regenerative practices and, more importantly, restricted the land from certain kinds of aggressive resale or conventional overplanting for the length of the agreement. He'd never told her. He'd signed it alone at the county office, quietly. The same year he'd attended that conference in Manhattan, and apparently never found the moment, or the courage, to explain it to a wife who trusted him with the accounting he handled, and never questioned. There was a complication folded inside the good news, the way there always was. The easement meant the land couldn't be sold to a corporate buyer for conventional row crop conversion, without triggering a costly penalty clause, which killed any chance of Curtis's suggestion to sell to the operations buying up marginal ground. But it also meant that whatever the new soil tests eventually showed, the appraisal process itself would have to account for a designation the bank's original appraiser had apparently missed entirely. Barbara sat down right there on the porch steps, the letter shaking slightly in her hand, and understood for the first time that Donald hadn't just left her a notebook of hopeful notes. He'd been quietly building toward this piece by piece for years, and had run out of time before he found the nerve to finish it, or to tell her any of it. She didn't know whether to be moved or furious. That night she was both, in waves that came one after another, until she finally fell asleep at the kitchen table, with the notebook open in front of her, one hand resting flat on the page, like she could reach him through it. She called Howard Reese's office the next morning for details, and what he told her only deepened the ache of it. Donald had apparently driven to Topeka alone on a Saturday, told her he was picking up a part for the swather, and spent 4 hours in a conference room signing paperwork that would take a decade to fully mature and pay out. He'd made 2 payments on the easement's administrative fees out of an account Barbara hadn't known existed, a few $100s at a time, quietly, the way a man saves for a gift he isn't sure he'll ever get to give. Reese said Donald had called him twice more after that, asking questions about how the designation would affect a future sale, how it would read to a bank appraiser, whether it could be explained simply to someone with no farming background. Reese had assumed, reasonably, that he meant a future buyer. Sitting in her kitchen, Barbara understood he'd meant her. It took her 3 days to stop being angry about it and start being grateful instead. Donald hadn't hidden this out of secrecy, she decided. Not really. He'd hidden it out of fear of being wrong, the same fear that had kept him from ever actually planting the rotation he'd spent 9 years reading about. He had been, in his own quiet way, exactly as afraid as she was now. He'd just run out of time to become brave about it. The first true test came in July, when the wheat came in on the untouched fields. The control, in Priya's words, the ground still farmed the old way, while the cover crop rotation had a year to establish. The yield was thin, worse than the year before. Exactly the kind of number the bank's original appraisal had predicted. Barbara stood at the edge of that field with the combine idling behind her, and felt the old fear return in full. The 11 days, the red circle on the calendar, the sense that she'd spent everything she had left chasing a dead man's handwriting instead of accepting the sensible offer sitting in a drawer. It was only later, walking the cover-cropped ground at dusk, that she noticed what she hadn't expected to see so soon. The soil under the sun hemp and vetch was dark and loose, where she dug her boot heel in, holding moisture from a rain 3 days gone, in a way the wheat field beside it hadn't. Priya came out the following week with a soil probe, and confirmed what Barbara's hands had already told her. Organic matter climbing, water infiltration improving, the first measurable signs. Faint, but real. That Donald's notebook wasn't just hope written in the margins. It was working. Slowly. Not fast enough to satisfy a bank ledger yet, but working. She almost quit anyway. That was the part she never told anyone afterward. Not Sam, not Priya, not even Curtis when he eventually asked. In August, staring at a bank statement, thinner than she'd ever seen it. With the cash crop still a season away from full rotation, and every dollar of savings gone into seed, and a drill retrofit Sam's generosity hadn't fully covered. Barbara sat in Donald's old chair in the shop, and let herself consider, seriously, calling Grady Simmons and telling him to take the land. It would have been easier. It would have hurt in a cleaner way than this slow, uncertain, grinding hope did. She held the sorghum seed jar from the kitchen windowsill in her lap that night. She'd carried it out to the shop without quite meaning to, and turned it over in her hands the way Donald always had every October. And something about the weight of it, familiar and specific, made her put the phone down instead. She planted the second season's rotation the following spring, with a steadiness she hadn't had the first time. The mistakes came less often. Her hands had learned the drill's rhythm. Sam's son helped her expand the no-till acreage across the rest of the farm. And Priya came out twice a month now instead of once, tracking numbers that had begun unmistakably to climb. The second harvest told a different story than the first. Barbara stood at the edge of the same field, where she'd stood a year earlier feeling the ground give way beneath her, and watched the combine cut through wheat that stood taller and thicker than anything Donald had grown in the last decade of his life. The cover-cropped acreage, now in its second full rotation, yielded nearly 40%, above the county average, a number Priya read off her tablet twice, like she didn't quite trust it either. The sorghum came in heavier too, roots holding through a dry August that would have scorched the old fields the way it always had. For the first time since the funeral, Barbara cried in a field, not from grief, but from something closer to vindication. Standing in dust that Donald's own handwriting had in the end made fertile. She paid the outstanding balance to First Prairie Bank in full that October. Not the extension amount, not a negotiated settlement, but the entire $340,000, 2 harvests, and 18 months after the letter that had told her the land wasn't worth enough to secure it. She wrote the check herself at her own kitchen table, in the house where she'd once assumed she understood nothing about running a farm. She drove into town to deliver it in person rather than mail it, and stood in the same lobby where Grady Simmons had once slid an extension form across a desk like a kindness. He shook her hand this time, and there was something almost sheepish in it. The handshake of a man who had once written off 640 acres as a lost cause, and now wasn't sure what to say to the woman who'd proven him wrong with a dead man's handwriting and 2 years of blistered hands. Barbara didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply signed where he pointed, folded the receipt into her coat pocket, and drove home past fields that, for the first time in a decade, belonged to no one but her. What surprised her most, in the months that followed, wasn't the money, though the money mattered more than she would ever admit out loud to Curtis. It was the way she'd started walking the fields the way Donald used to. Hands in the soil, before her eyes even confirmed what her fingers already knew, narrating the low ground and the fence line to no one in particular, the way he'd narrated it to her all those mornings she'd only half listened. She understood the farm now, in a way she never had while he was alive, to explain it for her. Grief hadn't done that. Work had. 2 years of failing at something and getting back up had done what 30 years of marriage, however loving, never quite required of her. Grady Simmons called her personally the following spring, his voice carrying a warmth she hadn't heard from him in that office 2 years earlier. The bank, he explained, had commissioned a new appraisal. County land values had shifted, and the regenerative acreage on the Lewis farm was drawing attention from agricultural economists studying drought resilience across western Kansas. Willow Bend Farm was now valued at nearly triple what it had been assessed at the year Donald died. The bank, he said carefully, had a client interested in purchasing the property outright, at a price that would set Barbara up comfortably for the rest of her life. He wanted her to know First Prairie would be glad to help facilitate the sale. No obligation, of course, purely as a courtesy given everything she'd been through. Barbara sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at the 200 acres where the cover crop had taken hold, green and stubborn against ground the bank had once called worthless. On the windowsill in front of her sat the seed jar, refilled that October the way it had been every October for 30 years. Because she had done it herself this time, kneeling in the same rows Donald had knelt in, holding a handful of sorghum up to the light before pouring it back in, checking on old friends the way he always had. "Tell your client no," she said, and found she didn't need to say anything else. Grady was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the practiced smoothness of a man delivering an offer. "Can I ask why? It's a fair price, Mrs. Lewis. More than fair." "I'm sure it is," Barbara said. But you told me this land wasn't worth enough to secure a loan 2 years ago. I'm not interested in selling it to you now that you've decided it's worth something after all." She said it without anger. It was simply a fact, the way Donald's notebook had taught her to state things, plainly with numbers where numbers belonged, and nothing dressed up as more than it was. She hung up the phone and walked out to the porch, where the light was doing the thing it always did at that hour, sliding low and gold across land that had buried her husband under the cottonwood at the property line, and had, in its own slow and stubborn way, given her back a life she hadn't known she still had in her. She wasn't the woman who'd stood at that sink 4 months into her grief, waiting for someone else to tell her what the ground beneath her was worth. She knew what it was worth now. She'd learned it with her own hands, in her own time, in the exact rhythm her husband had left for her, without ever quite finding the courage to say it out loud himself. Curtis came around eventually, the way people do once the outcome makes them look prescient, rather than foolish for having doubted her. He never quite apologized, but he started asking sincerely how the rotation worked, and Barbara found she didn't mind explaining it to him, the way Priya had once explained it to her. Jason drove out from Wichita more often that first winter, after the debt was cleared, and one Saturday in November he walked the fields with her in his work boots, asking questions about vetch and organic matter that she answered easily now, the way Donald once had, narrating the ground like a letter from an old friend. She caught herself smiling at how strange it was to have become, without meaning to, the person in the family who understood the land best. The following October, Barbara stood at the kitchen sink the way she had every morning since Donald died, watching the gray light climb over fields that were no longer bare stubble in the fall, but green with cover crop, holding water and soil the way they were always meant to. The coffee maker gurgled at 5:12, the way it always had. She poured herself a cup, walked to the windowsill, and lifted the sorghum seed jar to the light the way Donald used to, checking the seed the way he'd taught her, without ever meaning to teach her at all. Then she carried it out to the barn, where the notebook sat open on the workbench to a page she'd read so many times. The ink had begun to soften under her thumb, and she got to work. Barbara Lewis didn't sell. She stayed, and she kept the notebook on the kitchen table where anyone could see it, its pages soft now from being read so many times, no longer a secret her husband had almost taken to his grave, but a map she had finished walking on her own.